Cyberpunk Red. What is it? How do I play it? And how do I navigate this 458-page long rulebook? Cyberpunk Red is a new dystopian tabletop RPG that was released in November of 2020. It is a continuation of Cyberpunk 2020, which was released in 1990, and it comes before in the timeline of the newly released video game Cyberpunk 2077. This RPG takes place in 2045. Today I'm going to focus on how to easily digest this rulebook and some tips I've learned along the way. If you're pumped for Cyberpunk Red and are interested in more videos on this topic, please let me know by liking and subscribing so that I can provide more valuable content for you around this RPG system. This rulebook is a little bit different in that it doesn't have actual chapter numbers, it just has titles, so that's how I will be referring to it in this video. I found that this rulebook is not super organized, so the goal here is to help you save some time and making sure that you can master the rules and navigate the rulebook as efficiently as you can. I'll try to call out the easiest place to find your most useful information. In addition, I've organized all the sections by the type of information that you're going to find in that section. So for example, lore, character creation, GM guidance, or some of the stories. So look out for that in the upper left-hand corner so you can easily identify what each section is going to be about. So the first section, Never Fade Away, is a story, one of a few to come in the rulebook, and this one is set in 2013. So this goes for all of the story chapters in this rulebook, and that is to say, it is not essential for you to read it to be able to play this game. However, it does provide additional lore, and quite frankly, it's just fun to read. So I would recommend you read them, but if you're short on time and want to get right to playing the game, these are sections that you can skip for now. The next section, View from the Edge, is an intro to the setting and lore of Cyberpunk. I would recommend reading this section, particularly if you're a GM. It will help to set up the basics of the setting, and it includes some cool things like street slang, which will be helpful if you're really wanting to get into roleplay for this system. Starting on page 22, there is base information about tabletop RPGs. This part of the rulebook can be skipped if you are not new to tabletop role-playing games. The next section, Soul in the Machine, is the first on character creation. So my first tip for you is actually going to be to skip to page 120 because this page has the basics for reading a character sheet and where you track everything. For me, it's more helpful for me to understand how the character sheet is laid out and what I'm looking for as I'm creating my character before I really get to know anything about character creation. Then I would recommend diving into this section as it gives some basics on role-playing tips, but it also is the first place for you to really dive into the different roles that you can play in the Cyberpunk universe. In addition to these 10 different roles, there are also 3 different ways that you can create a character. So this is a section that lays everything out for that. My other call out here is there are specific role abilities. However, these don't come until later in the book. So you might have to do some flipping back and forth. If you're trying to find out more information on a role, page 142 is where you're going to find out the detailed role abilities for all of these different options. The next is Tales from the Street, which is a deeper dive into character creation. It goes into how to create your Lifepath, which is essentially a guided way to make character backstory, which I highly recommend for every PC playing an RPG because it gives your character a little bit more life, but it also gives your GM something to grab onto and make it more immersive for your player in the story. Next, we have Fitted for the Future, which goes all into your skills and stats. This section and the next one is not necessarily one that you have to read from start to finish, but rather something that you'll work through as you create your character. This section also includes your first look at weapons and armor, which appears later, and also gives you a look at fashion and gear, which plays a pretty large role in this game, more so maybe than other popular RPGs. This next section, putting the cyber into the punk, is the last step in character creation, and it's for all that juicy cyberware. This section is one I would recommend spending a good amount of time on, just so you can understand what everything costs and what you want to save up for in the future. I'm curious what character character role sounds the most fun to you guys. When I was reading through it personally, the text stood out to me, so I'm pretty excited to play that. The next section is The Fall of the Towers, which is a story that takes place in 2022. Next, we have Getting It Done, which is the start of the core rules. This section I would recommend both players and GMs spend a good amount of time on, just so you're familiar with how the system works. It goes over different measurements, combat, explaining the D10 system, which is essentially just rolling a D10, adding your stat and your skill. And included here is also a reference for what amount of points means what when you put them in your skills. So as an example, when I was building my character and I put 18 points into drive, that was extremely excessive because apparently 18 means that you're a professional race car driver, that everyone knows your name. So it's a good reference to balance out what points you want to put where for your skills, and also for the GMs to look at as they're going through and playing this game for the first time. Next is Friday Night Firefight. And this is in-depth look at combat. So again, one I would recommend for both PCs and GMs to read. It explains initiative and actions and what that all entails. There's also a deeper dive into armor and vehicle combat. And if you're new to the system, vehicle combat might be something that you add on later if you're looking to simplify the system a little bit more for your first few sessions. So if no one's really interested in that, or no one's playing a Nomad, feel free to skip that for now and add it in later. Next is Netrunning, which is actually focused a little bit more on character creation, specifically if you choose the Netrunner role. So this is something that's really interesting to look into, but if no one's playing Netrunner, it's not necessary for you to read through. Next is the Trauma Team, which is more on core rules, which goes more in depth on taking damage and what trauma teams are, which in this universe is basically a team of people that's on call in case you get injured. So it's essentially like a AAA for injuries. There's also a list of drugs here, traumas and therapy, and a more in-depth look at cyberpsychosis. So this is really cool for GMs to look into, as it's a good way to make sure there are consequences for the things that your players do. I would recommend spending a bit of time here and making yourself familiar for all of these things. The next few sections I'm just going to chunk together because it's a ton of information on the lore and setting of Cyberpunk. First, we have Welcome to the Dark Future, which includes a timeline of the Dark Future history. This is not necessary for play, but if GMs and PCs want to get more into role-playing, it could be helpful. The Time of the Red. This is a really easy place to get inspiration if you're writing your own campaigns or one-shots. It lists out the major corporate players in the Time of the Red, and that is when this RPG takes place. Welcome to Night City is lore about the major city that this RPG takes place in. If you're trying to save some time, you can skip the history and go to page 295 for more current day city information. There's also useful information on key landmarks and the different zones in the city. And there's also a map of Night City in this section, which is super helpful. Also included is a list of notable people and gangs in Night City, which is basically just built-in NPCs for GMs to help build upon or use to improv. Next is Everyday Life. You'll notice that this RPG is really focused on immersion and actually living your life in this world. So there's crime and punishment, transportation, food, media, paying your rent, those kind of things are essential to the gameplay. The New Street Economy is next, which is a history of the economy, but most importantly, starting on page 340 is an exhaustive list of weapons, ammo, armor, gear, clothing, drugs, cyberware, housing, and more. It also includes on how best to make a living based on what role you've chosen in character creation. So this is a really good place to reference all of those charts and things in one place. So next is running Cyberpunk. If you're a more experienced GM, you've probably gotten all that you need up to this point, including lore and setting information to dive right in and GM this setting. However, the beginning part of this chapter includes the recommended improvement points to give your PCs to be able to advance them throughout the game. There's also a good amount of stats for generic enemies here, so if you're looking for an improv encounter, it's a good place to go. Particularly if you're a new GM, I would definitely recommend reading through this. There's a lot of good inspiration and information and a bit of structure to get you going for your first session in the Cyberpunk universe. Next are scream sheets, which are essentially newspaper articles for GMs to get inspiration for one-shots. So if you're just going to be a player character, I'd recommend skipping over these in case your GM decides to use some of them. And finally is the last story called Black Dog, which is in the current day 2045 timeline. So that is the Cyberpunk Red rulebook breakdown. If you're interested in more Cyberpunk Red information, let me know down in the comments, and check out some of my other videos on being a new GM or a keeper below.